Okay, so welcome to the very first Vivat Voice. My name is Tanya Lee, and I teach at the middle school. I teach grade 6 humanities, and as most of you know, humanities is social studies and language arts taught as one course. The examples that I'm going to be showing you today come from my own practice, but I hope that many of you can see the possibilities for adapting to meet the needs of your classroom. I wanted to share with you an activity that I've started using in my classroom this year. I call the activity synthesization stations. And the impetus that led me to create this activity was that I wanted to really start looking at ways as to how I could implement all of the professional development that we've been undergoing over the last 4 or 5 years. Paying particular attention to the professional development on differentiated instruction and meeting the needs of the 21st century learner, specifically fostering creativity. So I was looking to work with those two aspects of professional development. But I also wanted to create an activity. I found that my teaching methodology seemed to be lacking a little something. This was sort of my tried and true practice. I taught something, I allowed my students to practice it, and then I assessed their understanding of that concept that I had taught them. And then I took that and I shelved it, and I took out my next topic and I taught that, practice, assess, and I taught in different ways, I allowed my students to practice in different ways, I assessed in different ways, but still there was something missing. And I've realized over the past couple of years that that missing component was really allowing my students to reflect on what they were learning and also to make connections with prior knowledge and understanding. So I've really been trying to change my teaching methodology to model this flow here of teach, practice, assess, reflect, connect. So that's really what I was trying to do with this activity that I'm going to be telling you about today. I wanted to include these steps of reflection and connection, and at the same time implementing the Pro-D that we've been working on. I really believe that when you allow your students to reflect and connect, that's when kids are getting into these upper tiers within Bloom's taxonomy, specifically with synthesis, hence the synthesization stations. I wanted to give my students the opportunity to combine the parts to form a whole, to take all those pieces that I was teaching them and create the bigger picture. Hence the activity synthesization station. So what is this? Synthesization stations are differentiated tasks that provide students with different avenues to make sense of what they're learning. I divide my classroom into a number of stations and offer differentiated activities for them. They're organized. I provide the environment, I provide the materials, I even provide the prompts of what I want them to work with, but each task at each station allows for flexibility. And I really believe that I try and accommodate my learners' preferences. So I have typically worked with 4 stations. You can really work with any number of stations that you want. I found, looking at my grade 6 students, that these 4 stations really reflect who I have as learners in my classroom. I use a written, visual, verbal, and spatial expression station. In the future, I'd like to also incorporate a technological station. Perhaps science teachers could consider having a practical lab or experimentation station. However you want to modify that is really up to you. This is what I've used in my classroom. So starting with the first station, the written expression station, this station is really for my students who love to write and who take a lot from the writing experience. So I provide my students with a prompt at their station. For example, the first prompt that I allow them to choose from is pick any character from the Not-So-Star-Spangled Life of Sunita Sen. Where on the political spectrum would you place them and why? So the Not-So-Star-Spangled Life of Sunita Sen was a novel that I studied with my students. And then at the same time, I was teaching them about politics and government, and we were looking at the political spectrum. The political spectrum is pretty heavy stuff for your average grade 6 student. And so I wanted to see if my students could start bridging those two things together. At this station, I just put some desks together, set up some laptops for them, provide them with the prompt, and let them work through that in either a narrative way or an expository way. Let them start thinking through those two ideas and how they can bring them together. So there's some real reflection going on as to what they've learned in both those tasks of the novel study and what we've learned about the political spectrum. And then there's the connection taking place, bringing those two elements together. The second station that I use is a visual expression station. I have a lot of really artistic students in my class. They're visual learners. This is the prompt that I provide my students with at the visual expression station. So again, you are to create a drawing or a painting of the political spectrum using symbols and metaphors rather than words. So at the same time that I was teaching my students about political spectrum, we were also doing a unit on poetry, and we'd spent a lot of time working through the idea of what is a metaphor, how do you use symbols, imagery, those sorts of things. So again, it's bridging together two different themes. The students loved this station. I provided them with a whole bunch of artistic tools, paper of all sizes, charcoal, crayons, magazines for cutting, paint, and they were allowed to express themselves and give me their concept of the political spectrum in whatever way made sense to them. To give you an example of something that I got out of this from a student, one of my female students, bearing in mind this is a 10-year-old, she drew a series of a horse. And she represented the left side of the political spectrum as a horse in a stable. And then there was a series of drawings, and eventually it led to the right side of the spectrum, a horse free in a field. And when I spoke to her about that, she said, well, the horse in the stable, it's having all of its needs met, it's being groomed, it's being fed, it's being taken care of, but it's trapped. It has no freedom. Whereas on the right-hand side of the spectrum, the horse is free to gallop, roam, but it has to fend for itself. And I thought, that's pretty incredible for a 10-year-old student to come up with. The third station that I work with is a verbal expression station. So these are grade 6 students. This is probably one of their strengths, being vocal. And so I wanted to give them the opportunity to process what they were learning verbally. What I provide for them at this station is just a series of conversation prompt cards, probably a stack of 6 or 7 different cards. And my classroom is really conducive to this station. I have some couches, comfy chairs, and the students just gathered in this area and they worked through these cards one after another, and they just each took their turns sharing. It didn't even take a lot of interference on my part. The students just grabbed the cards and went with it, and they were very respectful of one another, and this was a really beneficial station for those students that took part in it. And here's some students in the process. The last station I want to share with you today is my spatial expression station. This is for my students that love design, they think spatially. Again, I provide them with a prompt, and then I also provided them with 50 or so slips of paper, and on each slip was a character's name from a novel that we had read, a theme that had come out from a poem, different vocabulary that we had been using in our political spectrum, government, and poverty units. And I asked my students, can you place these strips of paper out on these large sheets of chart paper and then make connections between these different themes, and on those lines of connection, tell me, write down how those things are connected. And they had some fun with that, and it was interesting to see the creative ways in which they were able to make connections between things that you wouldn't necessarily have seen the connection being there, the natural connection. So here's some students at work, and here was the final result. So you can see a lot of connection happening here. So this is really the concept of synthesization stations. I hope that you can see some potential application for your own classrooms and how you can modify it to best meet the needs of your learners. Thank you for joining me.